In the midst of extolling the virtues, the power, and relevance of the gospel of Messiah to his Roman Messianic readers, Paul makes a rather shocking statement that many, within and without our faith community today, either embrace or ignore. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Messiah, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. The gospel applies to the Jew first. And oh, by the way, it applies to you non-Jews as well. What in the world could the renowned apostle to the Gentiles mean by this confusing statement? Well, in this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer, let's dig into this challenging Pauline passage and see if we can nail down what Paul meant by the statement to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Shalom and welcome. Shalom, 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 and greetings, saints of the Most High, and welcome to the Messianic Torah Observer. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to fellowship with me here today. I'm Rod Thomas, and as always, it is my hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer finds you, your families, and fellowships well and blessed. Well, today's discussion is entitled, Jews Before Gentiles? How does that work? I know, it's kind of a weak title, but I had a hard time coming up with anything on this. But for the sake of just administratively putting something out there to label this, I went with Jews before Gentiles. How does that work? And the biblical basis for our discussion this evening is found in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, which reads, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, of Messiah. For it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." One of the keys to understanding some of Paul's most challenging and difficult passages is to also examine all of his other related passages in addition to related Tanakh or Old Testament, as well as in addition to Yeshua's teachings. When all of these related passages are brought together, especially when they're brought together under the light of responsible biblical contextual understanding, well, we stand a much better than average chance of accurately understanding the apostles' most challenging and difficult to understand passages, which, of course, is what we're attempting to do in this series. We must always keep in the back of our minds that Bible must always interpret itself. Let me repeat that. Bible must always interpret itself. I get it. It's not proper English, but it's true none the same. And then we must apply this understanding to all our biblical studies. This must be a habit. I would dare say a ritual, but a practice that we must always implement when we study Scripture. You see, it is imperative that we resist the natural urge or tug to grasp biblical isolated sound bites, which is my term of just taking an isolated verse, but resist that tug to take that isolated sound bite and create an understanding or even a doctrine on a loose understanding of those isolated sound bites or isolated verses, as so many folks have done over the centuries. Case in point, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in church. Now, if we were to simply base our understanding of this curious yet extremely controversial passage from an isolated baseline reading of it without taking into account history, context, culture, and other related passages, well, the meaning of this scriptural soundbite, if you will, would clearly suggest that women cannot teach, women can't preach, women can't publicly pray or prophesy in Messianic assembly gatherings. They can't do jack but sit there and be quiet. Why? Because it's a shame for women to speak in the church. But as we saw in our extensive examination of this passage, where we did employ the very study techniques I just mentioned above, Paul was not in the least excluding women from leadership roles in our faith community. Far, far, far from it, in fact. And the same thing applies to this and all the other passages we're going to look at in this series going forth. So with that in mind, let's get into Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and see if we can figure out what Paul means by to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now, for most of us with any appreciable degree of true biblical understanding, and I'm not talking about doctrinal, nor am I talking about denominational understanding, but for any of us with any appreciable degree of biblical understanding, especially when that biblical understanding is from a Hebraic perspective, our focus passage may not be that difficult to understand. It really may not be. For those of us that fall within this category I just mentioned, the challenge is really understanding the fullness of what Paul is writing about. The applicability of Paul's statement to our day-to-day walk with Messiah, such that why any of this should matter to you and me. How to explain the meaning of this passage to those who may ask us for an explanation of the passage. These are the things that may be challenging to those of us who have some background or foundation of Paul's writings. So it's not too hard for us to understand the baseline meaning. It's just applying that, being able to explain it effectively and so forth. Obviously, those who find themselves in denominational Christianity, a true understanding of this Pauline passage may be hidden beneath layers of tradition, layers of false teachings, layers of doctrine, such as the false doctrine of replacement theology. Thus, our aim here this evening is to work through these interpretive issues so that we may reap the spiritual benefits, that is, the spiritual gifts that Paul sought to bring to his Roman readers back in the day, back in verse 11. Indeed, the fullness of this content-rich passage is too good for any true believer in Messiah to simply read over and ignore, hoping that it somehow goes away because it doesn't support one's biases and understanding of how the kingdom of God is supposed to work. Let's first step back and quickly review what we've learned about Paul and his letter to the assembly of Roman Messianics up to this point. The first one. The letter was written to a devout assembly made up of both Jewish and non-Jewish Messianics. Number two, Paul deeply admired the Roman Messianic assembly and desperately desired and planned to visit them as quickly as the opportunity presented itself. Number 3, Paul's admiration for the Romans was spiritually deep and abiding, leading him to refer to them as saints and praying on their behalf to Yahweh Yahuwah, through Yeshua constantly. Number 4, despite Paul not being the founder of the Messianic Assembly of Rome, it is apparent that the apostle still saw himself as the assembly's overseer, or as the assembly's spiritual father, so to speak. And lastly, number 5, Paul preached and he taught the gospel of God throughout the Roman Empire, the very same gospel that Yeshua taught. That gospel was inclusive of both Jew and non-Jew alike. And Paul desired to share this inclusive gospel with the Messianic assembly in Rome. So now we're at the place in Paul's letter to the Romans where the apostle explains to his readers that his decision not to visit them up to this point had not been based upon an oversight, nor was the decision not to come made because he couldn't fit the visit into his extremely tight evangelical schedule. But we find much later on in this letter the reason why Paul had failed to visit Rome up to this point. And it's found in Romans chapter 15, verses 19 through 24. And the King James Version reads, "Through mighty signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and round about unto Illyricum, I have fully preached the gospel of Christ, of Messiah. Yea, so have I strived to preach the gospel, not where Messiah, not where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another man's foundation." Verse 21, "But as it is written, to whom he was not spoken of, they shall see, and they that have not heard shall understand. For which cause also I have been much hindered from coming to you. But now, having no more place in these parts, and having a great desire these many years to come to you, whensoever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you. For I trust to see you in my journey, and to be brought on my way thitherward by you, if first I be somewhat filled with your company." Again, that was Romans chapter 15, verses 19 through 24. So it seems relatively evident from this passage that Paul felt the Roman assembly had already been firmly established by the time he had begun his missionary and evangelistic work in various places throughout the Roman Empire. Remember, we had established early on in this study, especially in this study of this letter to the Roman assembly, that it had not been established by Paul, but instead the Roman assembly had been established by Roman Jews who had been a part of the very first Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit filled the 120 disciples of Yeshua on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, just 10 days after Yeshua ascended to his Father in heaven. So the Roman assembly had likely already been established long before Paul began his evangelistic ministry. So Paul saw no room necessarily, and that's just my wording, but he saw no fit into his evangelistic model since they had already been established. So he went to take care of those areas along his missionary route that needed the evangelism. Rome, he assessed, or had been led by the Spirit to understand, did not. I hope that makes sense to you. Thus, as far as we can tell from Romans 15, verses 19 through 24, Paul seemed to recognize Rome as having been taken care of in terms of evangelism, and it was not in need of his ministry in those years leading up to this letter. Despite the fact that Rome may not have been in need of Paul's evangelistic or missionary services, the apostle clearly had an unquenchable desire to visit there. At least one commentator I consulted suggested a reason for Paul's earnest desire to visit the Roman assembly: that it is conceivable that Paul envisioned Rome as the, quote, strategic hub of his work, for it was the center of the Gentile world in Paul's time, end quote. This was Tim Hegg, Romans commentary. He's a Torah scholar, as well as he's written a number of commentaries on the various apostolic writings, including a commentary on the book of Romans. But essentially what Mr. Hegg is pointing out, or Dr. Hegg is pointing out here, is that Paul, having completed the evangelistic arm of his missionary ministry, he was now turning his sights to the Messianic assembly in Rome to serve as a somewhat strategic hub for his work, for his ministry, going into the next realm of his ministerial work. Okay? I hope again that makes sense. But Paul chose to use, enough of that. Let's go on to understanding the whole concept of Gentile or Gentiles from Paul's and the Messianic Assembly's perspective, the use of the term Gentiles. Now that we've kind of come up to speed where we are in the first chapter of Romans leading up to verse 16. But now let's look at the term Gentiles. Paul chose to use the Greek term ethnos, in English, Gentiles, and he uses this term 19 times throughout the King James Version. And the term ethnos, as used by Paul throughout the book of Romans, is used to distinguish between non-Jews and the non-Jews, non-Jewish nations, and to distinguish between Jews. So it's a distinction between Jews and non-Jews, between Israel and the Gentile or the non-Israel nations. I hope again that makes sense, because we're using a lot of interesting terminology, and it is important to understand the perspective in which the apostle is writing from. So we always want a distinction between the Jew and the non-Jew, Israel and the non-Israel nations. So, because so much was riding on Paul's distinction between the two, given the mixed population of the Messianic assembly there in Rome. So he placed a lot of emphasis, and it's important for us to understand this distinction. Why is this important? Why is this important to our understanding of the focus passage to the Jew first and also to the Greek? Well, simply this. The faith that Yeshua and his anointed disciples turned apostles brought to the world began with the Hebrews. Some would say Jews. That faith was not a new faith by any stretch of anyone's imagination. In fact, that faith was an extension of the Hebraic faith that was initiated through the covenant that the creator of the universe made with Abraham. You see, Yahweh Yahuwah, honored that covenant which he passed down to Abraham's children, Isaac and Jacob, and then on through Jacob's 12 sons, whose children numbered as the sand which is upon the seashore. Genesis chapter 22, verse 17, and Genesis chapter 32, verse 12. The Almighty then built upon that original Abrahamic covenant with what Bible scholars have tagged as the Mosaic covenant. He established the Mosaic covenant between himself and the children of Jacob, or the children of Israel. Both covenants aimed at bringing Jacob's children into an eternal relationship with him, with the promise of restoring paradise that was lost when Adam fell. That is the kingdom of God. The Garden of Eden was God's kingdom here on earth, essentially. A lot of people don't see it that way, but in reality, that is the truth. You see, in a sense, these covenants form the very first iteration, or the very first versions of the gospel. The basis of the gospel that Yeshua and his disciples turned apostles taught and preached. Unfortunately, Israel failed to live up to her end of the covenant, and so she ended up temporarily forfeiting many of her covenant promises. For example, a divine protection, possession of the land, overall prosperity, etc. Now, some would argue that they didn't lose that, but in a whole sense, they did. They lost a lot of the benefits and the privileges of that covenant because of their disobedience, their stiff-neckedness. There's such a word. Their turning to idols, their violations and transgression of Torah. They've been pushed aside. But we'll find out that they haven't been completely abandoned. Just a temporary thing, because Father always has a plan to fix the things that Hasatan has messed up. And this is the whole point of the gospel message, especially the gospel that Yeshua and Paul taught. But true to Father's undying love for his people, Israel, the Hebrews, Father did not entirely abandon Israel. In fact, Father continued to honor provisions of his original covenant with the nation, even to the point of establishing a new or a renewed covenant with his people. Father built into this everlasting extension of the original covenant enhanced provisions for salvation, restoration, redemption of his wayward and stiff-necked people. This renewed covenant was inaugurated and it was established by his son, Yeshua HaMashiach, Yehoshua Messiah. For the kingdom that Yah was supposed to establish through the nation of Israel had not been scrapped. In fact, that promised kingdom was still coming whether Israel was ready for it or not. Hallelujah. The Creator would bring about this kingdom where he would ultimately dwell in the midst of his elect on his own terms, and through means that only those with eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts and minds to receive could fathom and understand. And, oh, by the way, the nation peoples of the world, the ethnos, the ethnoi, the Gentiles, well, they would have the divine opportunity to partake in those eternal covenant promises, which include having a true and substantive relationship with the Creator of the universe, and be a part of the Creator's coming kingdom through the provisions the Creator factored into his gospel. The ethnoi, the Gentile, would not supplant and replace Israel as those who hold to the false doctrine of replacement theology teach. Instead, the ethnoi, the Gentile, would simply come alongside her Hebrew and Jewish counterparts, and then reap the glorious, eternal benefits of Jehovah's plan of salvation, restoration, and redemption. A central truth that we must always bear in mind when discussing or studying Paul's teachings on the gospel is that without Israel, there is no kingdom of God and no salvation for the Jewish peoples of the world. There just isn't. So the bottom line thus far in our discussion is that the faith of the Roman Messianics was not a new or separate religion or faith. It was an extension of the original Hebrew faith that began in great part with Abraham. Therefore, let us not overlook the potential for conflict between Messianic Jews and Messianic non-Jews in the synagogue in Rome. Regardless the Messianic Jews' acceptance of the gospel, the conventional wisdom in rabbinic Judaism in Paul's day, well, it put uber importance, paramount importance on Jewish identity as the central requirement for one being part of or partaking of the covenant of Israel. The ethnoi, the Gentiles, were viewed then as being outside the covenant, as being other. Paul tangentially echoed this understanding in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12, where he described the non-Jewish peoples of the world as being those who were without hope and without God in this present world. But through the ministry of Yeshua and the power of the gospel that he and Paul taught and preached, well, non-Jewish people were no longer a people without hope. They were no longer a people without God in this world. Unfortunately, the uninformed Jew of Paul's day, and for that matter, even the uninformed Jew of our day, believes that for non-Jews to share in the promise of Yah's covenantal promises to Israel, well, they must convert to Judaism and live as a Jew. You often hear these folks described as Judaizers, trying to convince a Gentile would-be convert into the true faith to convert to Judaism first so that they would qualify to be a Messianic Jew, which included for men getting circumcised, and then, of course, for the men and women going through some training and going through a whole lot of different permutations to become Jewish. And then they would be viewed as qualifying to be a Messianic. But as I just stated, that understanding, the Judaizers' understanding of Gentiles, is baseless. You see, the Creator never established Judaism. Jews established Judaism as their chosen religion. And I'm not denigrating Judaism. Judaism has some wonderful qualities associated with it. These are our cousins. We are grafted into the commonwealth of Israel. So I'm not denigrating them, I'm denigrating their religion. Judaism stands, however, in stark contrast, and at times, total opposition to Father's Torah. It just does. Father's requirement of both Jew and non-Jew alike is that they accept Yeshua as their Messiah, that they turn from their wicked ways and be in covenant relationship with him through an obedience of faith. And I spoke about obedience of faith a few episodes ago, where we talked about when Paul mentioned bringing the nations into an obedience of faith. He wasn't talking about obedience to man-made traditions and laws, which is what many, especially those Judaizers, believed. Obedience to Judaism. And then you can be a part of the true faith once delivered. That's not what Father intended from his gospel message. In our focus verse, Paul declares to the Romans that he was not ashamed of the gospel of Messiah, of Christ. Interestingly, of Christ, as printed in the KJV. Well, it's a late addition, I should say, to the Greek text. In other words, it is not found in earlier Greek manuscripts of our text. But the ESV, the English Standard Version, having taken this fact into account correctly, translates the text as follows: "For I am not ashamed of the gospel," period, which is a more accurate translation of the verse. Paul declares that he is not ashamed of the gospel, which he realizes is dimly viewed by the world. The apostle recognized that the world was naturally hostile to the gospel. That natural aversion to the gospel makes the unconverted mind and heart incapable of understanding and appreciating the gospel. Indeed, the gospel requires the unconverted person to honestly see themselves in the state in which the unrepentant and unconverted fallen man presently exists. That is, in a deprived and hopeless state, and that he or she is in need of what the gospel can offer as the only solution to his or her desperate situation. Only the gospel has the power to reveal to the would-be convert just how foolish and pointless the world's wisdom truly is, especially when it is looked at in light of Messiah's expressed wisdom and truth. Paul, more than any other person living in his day, could appreciate and competently explain to the truth seeker just how foolish the wisdom of men is. That being his life as a Pharisee, married to Judaism and the oral traditions, compared to the wisdom and the truth of Messiah that he'd received on that road to Damascus on that faithful day several years before the writing of this letter. Indeed, he had come to, quote, know the reality of the gospel and the manner in which God takes what is foolish to man and turn it to proclaim and establish his greatness, end quote. And that was Tim Hague in his Romans commentary that I borrow from, that quote. You see, to Paul, the gospel was very real. The gospel was very powerful. And the gospel was needed by every single human being, man, woman, child. Everyone needed it. And Paul recognized this. And he stood ready to do any and everything in his power to deliver the gospel to any who would receive it. Paul then extols the tremendous virtues of the gospel, which he describes as the only thing that can lead one to salvation. In fact, Yah established the gospel as the only means by which people can be saved. Thus, the gospel, despite the world's inability to understand it on their own cognizance, is derived from God. It is simply the manifest power of God to rescue fallen man from eternal destruction. In looking at the gospel from a power perspective, the dunamis perspective in the Greek, Paul declares that the spoken words of the gospel message that can powerfully bring salvation to falling mankind, well, it's the very same power that brought creation into existence, and it's the same power that raised Yehoshua HaMashiach from the dead. The gospel is powerful than any man could ever imagine. Now, when we look at salvation in the Greek soteria, from Paul's perspective in this verse, It is all about people establishing a true and substantive relationship with Yahweh, Yahuwah. Paul saw salvation and the gospel as that which rescues fallen mankind from the just wages of sin, which we know to be eternal death. Romans chapter 6, verse 23. And providing in its stead eternal life. Salvation, according to Paul, cannot be earned, nor can it purchase or be purchased by anyone. In fact, salvation is a free gift of Yah to any who would receive it in faith in Yeshua Messiah. Thus, the gospel is the power of salvation to all who believe, all who pisteo. The object of this pisteo, belief, is Yehoshua. He is the object of that belief. For mankind on his or her own is incapable of obtaining salvation. She or he are hopelessly lost, and they're hopelessly damned to death. That's why the gospel is good news, because it provides man a way out of his or her eternal death sentence. Now, let's look at to all who believe. That highlights one of the central themes of Paul's letter to the Roman Messianics. And that theme has to do with immediate accessibility of salvation to any who would come to faith in Messiah Yeshua. For now, salvation would know no ethnic, no gender, no economic, nor cultural boundaries. And this goes completely contrary to the Judaizers. There was no boundary. In making the emphatic statement that salvation was accessible to everyone that believes, well, the apostle was clearly taking a jab at mainstream rabbinic bias toward all non-Jews. We were just talking about that. That bias essentially held that the eternal promises of Yah's covenant promises, which included salvation and entry into the kingdom of God, were only accessible to Jews and those who would become Jewish converts. Interestingly enough, however, the Roman Messianic Assembly had become the proof positive example showing that the rabbinic bias was no longer a valid doctrinal belief system. For Rome was home to a thriving Jewish Gentile Messianic community of faith. They may not have been perfect. They probably had many issues. But they were a thriving Jewish Gentile Messianic community of faith, worshiping as one body the God of Abraham, Yishak, and Yaakov. Hallelujah. That was the whole point behind the gospel. Now let's look at to the Jew first and then the Gentile part of verse 16. And it finds us at a place that traditional and fundamental Christianity is not at all comfortably equipped to deal with. Because here, the great apostle to the Gentiles gets real with his readers, revealing, as Tim Hague, again, the Messianic author, commentator, and Torah scholar, well, he states that this was Paul's modus operandi. For Paul saw and he understood the plan of salvation, redemption, and restoration. He saw it from a 35,000-foot view that few of us even today are, well, uncomfortably willing to match. And Paul not only understood the plan of salvation, redemption, and restoration at that elevated vantage point I just mentioned, he also practiced and executed that which he'd received and been instructed on. Because Paul routinely began his evangelistic outreach to the Jewish community first, with rare exceptions of any known ones, and then on to the non-Jewish communities. J.K. Messianic teacher, commentator, and author, well, he goes directly to the jugular in comparison to Hague on this issue. And, well, Hague seems to be a lot more, what is the word I want to use? Friendly. Let's just put it that way. McKee goes directly to the jugular, though. He says, quote, Paul does demonstrate a ministry preference to go to the Jewish community first, end quote. So McKee goes straight out and says he goes directly to the Jewish community first before he goes to the Gentile community. And that's exactly what it was. And then McKee writes, quote, Paul's evangelistic prioritization, if that is a word, I'm quoting here, Paul's evangelistic prioritization. Wow. Paul's evangelistic prioritization of ethnic Israel fits Jesus's teaching in Mark chapter 7, verse 27, and the portrayal of Paul's own ministry in Acts chapter 13, verses 5, and chapter 28, verse 17. Yet he will argue that God saves both Jew and Gentile by the same means, end quote. So, you see, the driving force behind the Apostle Paul's what I call modus operandi of evangelizing the Jew before Gentile was the apostles' dogged belief in the promises the Creator had made to his forefathers. I would refer you to Romans chapter 11, verses 26 through 28. And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them, when I shall take away their sins. As concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sakes. But as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sakes. How can Paul make such a statement? Wasn't he the illustrious apostle to the Gentiles? For Paul, the promises made to his ancient fathers had to be fulfilled. They absolutely had to. It was critical. And the apostle knew and believed with every fiber of his being that Jehovah was not a liar. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4, and Romans chapter 3, verse 4. Paul, being the penultimate Torah teacher that he was, knew better than anyone breathing air in his day the depths and significance of those ancient promises. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 17. But Israel shall be saved in the Lord, in Jehovah, with an everlasting salvation. Ye shall not be ashamed nor confounded. Ye shall not be ashamed nor confounded, world without end. Interesting wording. The key part of that I wanted you to get is the first half of verse 17 in Isaiah 45. It is, but Israel shall be saved in Jehovah with an everlasting salvation. The prophecy here. Zechariah chapter 9, verse 16. And the Lord, Jehovah, their God, shall save them in that day as the flock of his people. For they shall be as the stones of a crown, lifted up as an ensign upon his land. And lastly, I want to look at Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 33 and 34, which reads, but this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith Jehovah, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know Jehovah, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith Jehovah, for I will forgive their iniquity and I will remember their sin no more. The Jew coming to faith and salvation is a requirement for the gospel. Despite that which is erroneously taught both within and without our faith, the gospel is not only about Gentiles. I'm sad to deliver that news. In fact, nowhere in Scripture can one find a covenant that the Almighty made with Gentiles directly. Instead, the promises that were given to Israel had built into it provisions for Gentiles to partake in the blessings and commonwealth that is to come to Israel. But without Israel, the Gentile doesn't have a covenantal leg to stand on. Paul brilliantly expounded upon this essential truth when he later on in this very same letter, actually, to the Romans, how this Jew-Gentile thing is supposed to work in the plan of salvation and restoration. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read it all. It's Romans chapter 11, verses 13 through 32. And it talks about, and I specifically want to focus on verse 24, and it reads in the English Standard Version, "For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree," we Gentiles being described as the wild olive tree, and Paul continues, "and grafted," we the wild olive tree are grafted contrary to what is natural into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? So we see here that the olive tree, the natural olive tree, stands, and we are grafted in, us ethnoi, Gentiles are grafted into the natural baseline tree. That's how we need to look at this thing. So wherever the apostle went to deliver the gospel, his first stop was always the local synagogue as a matter of priority. And as part of his outreach to the Jew, Paul would preach to them about the salvation that had come to the Gentiles. This evangelistic approach was used for purposes of creating within the Jew jealousy that would lead the Jew to Yeshua as his or her Messiah. Again, this is all talked about in Romans chapter 11, verses 13 through 32. If you've not read it or you've not read it in a while, read it. Read it a second time. Read it a few times, because this sets the table on how the Gentile and Jew looks under Father's gospel plan, the plan of salvation, restoration, and redemption. This is how it's supposed to look. So Paul's use of first, or in the Greek protos, in our focus verse must be viewed from the perspective of priority. Paul is not at all suggesting that the Jew is superior biologically nor spiritually to the non-Jew. Jew and non-Jew are in fact equal in every respect in the overarching scheme of the gospel, which is the power of God unto salvation for the believing Jew and believing non-Jew, both being on equal par. Despite the Jew and non-Jew being on equal par as it relates to the gospel and the plan of salvation, Paul brings to the Romans' attention that the gospel that he preached did have factored into it a significant degree of focus on the Jewish condition. And Paul saw this as absolutely critical, given that Israel was the cultivated olive tree that would receive the wild olive tree branch through a spiritual grafting process that I just read to you in verse 24 of the 11th chapter of Romans. So the Jew had to be taken care of when evangelizing and Paul delivering the gospel message, if but for the overall sake of the incoming Gentile. Romans chapter 11, verse 24. Again, without the Jew, there is not going to be a kingdom of God. That's just the way it works. This righteous and accurate understanding of the gospel that Paul possessed is a stumbling block, unfortunately, to the liberal Christian who, sees him or herself as Israel under the false doctrine of replacement theology. You see, replacement theology, in rejecting any future salvation of the Jew for all intents and purposes, it denies the power of the gospel to bring about salvation to the Jew, salvation to Israel. Not to mention any doctrinal thinking that usurps and replaces the Jew with the Gentile nations as being God's only elect peoples. Well, it fundamentally calls Jehovah a liar by insinuating that Yah does not honor his covenants with Israel. So what does this understanding of to the Jew first and also to the Greek mean for the modern Messianic? First and foremost, there can be absolutely no room for anti-Semitism in the body of Messiah. Secondly, if we are to take the Apostle Paul's example at its face value, the Hebraic roots, the Messianic community must consider some level of outreach to the Jewish community in her evangelistic work. Paul, as I've repeatedly made the case throughout this entire series, was hands down the best man on the planet at the time to fulfill the role as the apostle to the Gentiles, with the modus operandi of evangelizing the Jew first and also the non-Jew. That being said, most of us who are members of this faith are ill-equipped to effectively evangelize Jews. Yet, evangelism of the Jew requires uniquely qualified, spirit-filled individuals to effectively communicate the Hebraic, Torah-based gospel message to the Jew. I do believe there are souls who, like the Apostle Paul, I believe Father has people like that out there today. Father has and is currently preparing these individuals to evangelize the seed of Jacob. Because we're hearing stories that the Jew is turning to Yeshua Messiah. Maybe not in over huge numbers, but they are. There is movement in Israel. People are starting to turn to Yeshua. Yeshua is keeping, Yahweh, Yahuwah, he's keeping his promise. All Israel is going to be saved at some point in Father's good time. And Father is preparing a people to evangelize the Jewish people, Israel. I believe that Father has already laid out in his mind how and through whom he will bring Jacob to faith in his son, Yeshua Messiah. So I believe the question we must ask Father, as it relates to our respective ministry outreaches, is how, if at all, he desires us to deliver the gospel to the Jewish community. I like what McKee says in totality regarding this passage. This is the passage I'm speaking about is our focus passage, Romans 1:16. Well, he states something that is poignant, yet it's accurate in my opinion, by saying that the gospel belongs to both Jew and non-Jew alike. And thus there must be a significant degree of Jewish ministry factored into any messianic outreach and evangelism. At least some element there, taking them into account. Indeed, the promises of Yah were first rendered unto Israel, and it would be asinine to think even today that those promises no longer apply to the Jew today. Yet when all is said and done, there remains equal access to the gospel across the board of humanity, and we must do our part, whatever you and I have been called to do, in the Great Commission. So I pray that your eyes and minds were open to the fullness of what Paul meant when he wrote to the Romans that he was not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. So don't hesitate to contact us at our email address, perceptionwp@gmail.com, perceptionwp@gmail.com, if you have any questions about the content of this or any other post we put up. Check out our website at www.themessianictourobserver.org. Again, themessianictourobserver.org, our sister site being itsnotasyouperceive.com. Both sites host a ton of content that we've put out over the last several years that will enhance your walk with Messiah, with Mashiach. You'll also find on these websites the social media platforms on the website that you can follow us on if you're so inclined, as well as the various methods in which you may support this ministry with your financial gifts and donations if you are so led. And with that, we'll close out this installment of the Messianic Tour Observer. And until next time, my friend, may you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. Shalom. Take care.